A warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming to this special WPL lecture. It's a real honor to have the president of one of United Nations development agencies. The UN has many agencies, as you know, from the International Fund for Agricultural Development, based in Rome. It's a real honor, a real pleasure to have him here. I think I told some of you that he gave a talk about a year or so ago, really mesmerizing. I still recollect every word he said, and questions that challenged him in the Q&A session. Dr. Kanayo Nwanze is a very special individual in the sense that he's been an academic before he entered the world of policy. He's been the president of this UN agency for now 8 years, 2 terms, just around 8 years, and so has plenty of experience of the challenges that the world currently is facing around different development issues. And so hopefully this evening we will hear from that perspective, from that experience. But at the same time, the reason I mentioned the academic side is because he will also be presenting a narrative which has a kind of an academic perspective, I expect. And so in that sense, it's quite distinctive to have an individual out there in the world who brings both perspectives to bear on the challenges that the world community faces. The title of his talk is on the thing. I forget. It's Connecting the Dots, How Development Grows Peace and Stability. And that's, again, bringing lots of disciplines of social sciences together: economics, politics, law, and sociology, and science as well. In fact, he's trained as a scientist and has moved into this space, so it's quite impressive. So I'm looking forward to this. He will speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we have therefore plenty of time for a Q&A session. So as he's speaking, please think of those questions you want to ask about the world's development issues that you can put to him, and I'm sure you'll get some interesting answers back. So without further ado, a warm welcome to Dr. Nwanze.
Thank you very much, Professor Muthu. It's good to be back. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Let me thank Professor Muthu for his kind invitation to return to Warwick this year. As I said, it's a great pleasure to be here. I remember our interaction last year about this time, well, a month later than it was last year. So today I would like to share with you some of my perspectives in the area of how rural development is fundamental to peace and stability. I had a very stimulating conversation earlier today with some of you, just after lunch. I will try not to go too much into what my institution does, IFAD. I invite you to go to our website and to find out what we do. But we basically, as Professor Muthu said, Abine said, we are a specialized agency of the United Nations, but we're also the only financial institution within the UN system of specialized agencies. The interesting thing about our work is that it takes us to places where most other development agencies do not go to. Conflict-affected areas, as well as post-conflict situations. And simply because poverty and hunger run deepest in these areas, it is IFAD's mandate to try as much as possible to reach the remotest parts of the developing world. Why is that so? For those of you who were not here last year, I'll just give you 2 figures. The first is that around 3 billion children, women and men, live in the rural areas of developing countries. Now, yes, with the world population reaching 7.4 billion, they constitute about 40% of our human family. You certainly cannot achieve sustainable development globally if you ignore 40% of the human race. Now the second, which is again more a bit startling, is that 75% of the world's poorest and the world's hungriest and malnourished live in rural areas in developing countries. Now, put that into context. There are many who argue that by 2030, 60% of the world's population will be rural. Sorry, will be urban, not rural. I wish it was the other way around. Would be urban. And so, why all that investment in rural areas? But the fact remains that food production is predominantly a rural enterprise. Well, of course, there are city farms. There's peri-urban agriculture. But the majority of the food that is consumed in the developing world would always remain rural. And why then shouldn't we invest in rural populations? So that's one argument. Because farming, irrespective of the size or the nature of it, it's a business which is predominantly rural. And the population that engages in food production are small rural people. As I said, we go to places where most other UN agencies, development agencies, and NGOs never go to. Essentially because poverty and hunger run deepest in the rural areas. There are situations where there's abject poverty in urban areas, but those are essentially man-made. Now, my institution works in 98 countries, and a good number of them are either currently in conflict situations or they are what we describe as post-conflict countries. That is, we have programs, we invest in these countries: Afghanistan, Colombia, Congo, DRC, Eritrea, Mali, Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, and many more. Now, but people tend to assume that when conflict breaks out, development ends. But that's not the case. In fact, in many of these conflict-affected countries, farmers and producers continue to produce food. Not all of the population depends on emergency assistance. And in these areas, as long as the rain falls, farmers will continue to grow their farms. They don't stop. And when the conflict ends, we observe that nations where the agricultural systems have remained intact in rural areas bounce back faster than countries where agricultural systems are completely affected. So maintaining the development process, maintaining cohesion in rural areas during conflict situations is very important. A statistic I can share with you: 50% of food that is consumed today in Syria is still produced by Syrian farmers. Not all Syrians, even in the afflicted areas, have quit their farms. As soon as there's a lull in the war, they go back to farm. And many of them are still at home, on their farms, trying to preserve both their lives and their livelihoods without migrating. And we, IFAD, have continued to invest in the programs we support in Syria until just last year. The same with Yemen. Only last year, we were forced to close our offices, our country office in Yemen, when the building or the area where our staff, our local staff were housed, was affected by bombing. And we had to take them across the border. Now, through nearly 40 years of our operation, we have seen how lack of development can lead to conflict, and how conflict can halt or even reverse development. Now, they are both intertwined. Some say lack of development results in conflict. Some say conflict results in a negative development. But it's not only that. Let's take the case of the migration of today, migration crisis. Now, today the world is seeing the largest ever in terms of the greatest mass of migration that ever occurred since World War II. Internationally, 247 million migrants occurred in 2015, internationally. We hear most of what we hear on television, on the news, on the media, is about the Mediterranean, the migration from North Africa, from the Middle East to Europe. But there are many other countries around the world. In Australia, with migrants from the Pacific, Thailand, Latin America. But has the situation improved? Let's take the case of the Mediterranean alone. We all have the statistics of what happened in the last 2 years, 2014 and 2015. But would you know that in the first 6 weeks of 2016, 76,000 migrants have tried to cross the Mediterranean. This is 10 times the number, the same period in 2015. 76,000 in 6 weeks. But the saddest part of it is that not all of them make it across the Mediterranean. 418 people have lost their lives. 418 people lost their lives in the 6-week period. So what causes people to migrate? Of course, definitely conflict, but also hunger and poverty, lack of opportunities, inequality, persistent inequality, and poor governance. But also lack of opportunity, because among the migrant populations that are trying to cross the Mediterranean, there are people from my country, Nigeria, there are Senegalese, there are Ivorians from Cote d'Ivoire, where there is no conflict. But these people are migrating because of lack of opportunity. So even lack of opportunity, inequality, and indignity oftentimes force people to migrate. The saddest part of it is that many of them do not make it. The news we all see on the media, on television, does not even tell us about the hundreds of thousands in the last decade that have tried to cross from the Sahel in West Africa right across to get to Libya. And how many of them never made it? Because they are trying to cross large expanses of nothing but sand. And so that region, that area of the Sahara is dotted by broken down vehicles and dried corpses of human beings who failed to make it. These are in the hundreds. We hardly hear about this. And not many of us associate the impact of climate change on migration. The changes in weather patterns that force people to leave their homes. How many of you here know that the so-called Arab awakening was also driven by long periods of drought? The World Bank has projected that in the next few years, we might have another 100 million migrants as a result of climate change. Now, that is a bit frightening. And we have studies that have shown that, or they've confirmed that there's a correlation between temperature changes and the outbreak of war. Does anybody remember the uprisings, the revolution, the 2011 revolution in Egypt? What were the words? Bread, freedom, dignity. People in the streets were shouting about bread, freedom, and dignity. What is the connection? Egypt is the largest importer of wheat flour, wheat products in Africa, the largest importer. In 2011, there were extreme weather situations. The price of wheat went up almost 6 times. Now, the average Egyptian family spends about 30% of its income on food, and bread is a staple part of the meal. So the Arab awakening in 2011 pushed wheat and bread prices higher in the region. In the case of Syria, they had consecutively 2 to 3 years of extended drought. Same thing in Tunisia. Farmers lost their farms, their crops dried up, and there was massive migration from the rural areas into the capital cities, Syria in particular. What was the result? Let's connect the dots. Extreme weather conditions, crop failure, massive internal migration, which the press never speaks about, or rarely speaks about. Then civil unrest, inequality, and political destabilization. That's how it all started. The Arab awakening, all linked with the impact of climate change. While some say it's political, of course, yes. But drought and changes in the weather was a primary driver of the oil prices. Every other thing came in after that. So anyone who questions the link between inequality and conflict should also look at the situation in Colombia. Colombia has been plagued by conflict for the last 55 years. The cost of how many people? 220,000 lives have died. But what is the problem? Why? It's not what you read in the press, but at the bottom of all of this were basically conflict in agricultural areas of Colombia. Unequal distribution of land, of wealth, and of human rights. Rights to land. 55 years, 220 lives in the last 5 decades. Again, land as an issue. Now, these are the conditions that lead people to migrate. It's not just not conflict due to war. There are other conditionalities. But these are the conditions that sometimes push people towards revolution and violence. And these are the conditions that the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, sets out to fix. When you think about it, think about the migration across the Mediterranean. The Somalian British-born poet or writer, in my own words, says, no parent in their right mind pushes his or her child into the sea only when the sea becomes safer than the land. You can imagine the desperation. When it's no longer safe for your children to live on land, you put them on a boat on the sea. There's a problem there. Why should the world ever wait for so long until the problem turns into a crisis? We spoke about this last year, if you remember. We spoke about the Ebola crisis, the Ebola outbreak. These international migrants, most of them were initially, for several months, internally displaced persons, IDPs. But as long as the problem remains local, remains within a country or a region or a sub-region, it does not catch the attention of the international development community. But only when it spills over, when it crosses oceans and deserts and seas into those borders where the so-called development community is sequestered, then it becomes an international problem. But it will cost us less if we were able to tackle the problem before it becomes an international crisis. Prevention is better than cure. A simple thing we all learned in high school, in elementary school. The world has spent billions of dollars trying to contain the Ebola crisis, when it would have cost us only a few $million when Ebola broke out way back in 1976 in the Congo. If we had invested, if the pharmaceutical company, if the medical profession found it to the benefit of the human race to invest in developing vaccines or whatever to control Ebola. But if profit is the driver for investment, then we as a human race are doomed. But anyway, let's get back to Agenda 2030 and smallholders. Now, what does Agenda 2030 of the Sustainable Development Goals aim to achieve? It aims to eliminate poverty in all its forms, inequality, hunger, undernutrition, and at the same time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to tackle the impact of climate change. A very ambitious agenda. And we have 15 years to achieve it. Can we make it in 15 years? Well, I'm an optimist. I say, well, yes, why not? We were able to achieve, to some extent, the MDGs in 15 years. In fact, before 15 years. So perhaps we can achieve at least the majority of the SDGs. Now, but achieving the SDGs, or Agenda 2030, will depend largely on working with small farmers in transforming the rural areas of developing countries. Why do I say that? Why do I say that? The transformation of the rural space to become economically viable places where people can live is crucial. If the world's population is going to rise, it's going to increase to about 9-point-something billion in the next, how many years? 35 years? By 2050. People are going to be demanding for more food. There'll be more mouths to feed. And that food is still going to come from rural areas. So if we're going to make the rural area attractive for your generation and your children's generation to stay in the rural areas, they have to be transformed. They have to become economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable for people to live in those places. Because that is where we have the most effective use of land, and the rural area will continue to remain the primary source of good water, clean air, and for jobs as well. If we think about environmental sustainability, the cities are not going to give us that. And there is a nexus between urban and rural development. The rural space will continue to provide food and job opportunities. The urban space will continue to provide opportunities for farmers to sell their goods. It's a dynamic relationship. So we cannot invest in building sustainable cities without building sustainable rural towns. This idea that we have to invest in building sustainable cities in order to achieve global sustainability is very narrow tunnel vision. We have to appreciate the role of rural areas. In the developed world, you do not only have one city-states, you have multiple cities. What used to be rural areas have become towns, and they have become capitals, or state capitals, or provincial capitals. And that's the same thing that has to happen in the developing world. Not just the capital city that attracts all the youth, and you end up having nothing but bulging rural ghettos where people have no hope. As a friend of mine said, we have to create jobs for the young population of today, because tomorrow is in their hands. If there are no jobs, there is no hope. Why would people go to school, get a degree, end up jobless. So no jobs, no hope. Now, 500 million small farms are the main producers of food in many developing countries. And this is going to remain so for decades to come. But as I said earlier, the paradox is that those who produce the food that we consume in the developing world are the same people who are poor and malnourished. So there is a disconnect. Now, some people say, well, can small farms feed the world? And they forget that there are small farms in the developed world. Those of you who are familiar with farming systems in Japan, in the Republic of Korea, South Korea, Norway, and Switzerland, they have small farms. Vietnam and Thailand, they have small farms. Vietnam today is the second largest exporter of rice. 60% of its farmers grow less than 2 hectares of rice farms. In China, small farmers cultivate less than 10% of the agricultural land globally. Less than 10%. But they produce 20% of the food. So you can see that it's an issue of productivity per unit. Now, successful farms lead to vibrant rural communities. And we have to look at farming beyond just putting the seed in the soil or milking the cow. We have to look at farming as a business, an economic business that generates wealth, that feeds people, and builds cohesion in rural space. And we have to look at it as a food system along the whole value chain. At each point of the chain, there are opportunities to create jobs, storage facilities, value addition, transformation, marketing. And that is where, for those of you here, the younger generation, another technology is that at your fingertips. We didn't have them when I was going to school. Is the digital technology, digital thinking. You can make farming so attractive, either in terms of accessing information or organizing farmers, purchasing items, inputs and outputs, the connectivity, trading, businesses. Now that is a technology that you have. Buying from small farmers, getting information about when to sell, when not to sell, or where to buy the produce from, or where to sell. So the farming itself becomes a very attractive engagement. And that everyone has the potential to become an entrepreneur. So you have a dynamic flow of economic benefits between the rural and the urban areas. But why am I addressing the younger population? Today, when you look around you, when you watch television, when you read the newspaper, it's certainly very depressing. And you ask yourself, is there any future for us? My answer is yes. Because the future is in your hands, and it will depend on how you make it. When I say to you, do not wait for government to create jobs. Government has a responsibility of putting in place the right infrastructure, the policy environment. But then you have the responsibility of creating the jobs yourselves and creating employment and wealth. But the government must fulfill its own responsibility, and you must fulfill your own, and also, of course, also the private sector. But who is the private sector? It's you out there. Every little entrepreneur is a private sector. But today in the world all over, most populations of the youth are unemployed. Now, imagine what's going to happen. That in the next decade, in the developing world, there'll be 600 million young people, 600 million young people in the next decade competing for 200 million jobs. What's going to happen to the remaining 400 million? In India, every year, 11 million young people are moving into the job market every year. In sub-Saharan Africa, 10 million every year. In my country, of those 10 million, 2 million people every year are coming out and into the job market, and there are no jobs. But why wait for government to create the jobs? But we have to get to the point that government becomes accountable for creating the environment that gives incentives for people to invest, for business to invest, and to take part in the development process. Now, if the world population is growing to 8 billion in the same period we're talking about, does it not make sense that the demand for food will continue to rise? How are we going to produce that food? So, we need the youth of today to be farmers and entrepreneurs of tomorrow. And I believe we have a responsibility to put in place the environment that makes young people take up the tools for production and development and not the arms of destruction. The way it is today, the young people are taking up arms of destruction because they do not see any future. But I argue that the future is there. It's in your hands. It will be what you make it. Sometimes I say that my generation has made a mess of the world. It is true, we have. In many parts of the developing world, we have nothing as inheritance to those coming after us. What do we have to show? But it doesn't have to remain so. The democratic process has to grow. It has to come about. People have to be organized to have a voice in government, in decision making, not to revolt, but to participate constructively. And the time will come when you must be making demands. And we have experienced that through our investing in countries where there's conflict, you are able to transform those areas into areas of peace and development. And I'm not just speaking out of a textbook. I'm speaking out of personal experience. In the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, IFAD invested in projects in the northeastern part of India, where it was conflict area, where, as they were described in those days, the Naxalites. We invested in them, in community development. As soon as these families saw the benefits in this development, the jobs were being created. The women, particularly the mothers, were instrumental in getting the young people to be engaged in community development. And as soon as they were making money, they dropped the arms for revolt and crisis and took up tools of construction. And that project was so successful that the government of India invested its own resources to multiply that program in 5 other states of northeastern India. And today we have a region where there is some peace. In the Niger Delta of my own country, Nigeria, which for some time was known as a no-go zone. But if I'd invested in rural communities, in young people, and got them engaged in fish farming. These are mangrove areas where it's very conducive for fish ponds. And I visited this in 2013, 2014. And I saw young men and women, some of them graduates, participating in fish farming and vegetable gardening. making money. Why would anybody go and pick up arms if you can reasonably make money with your own hands? So there is, while we invest in development, we also invest in peace. In South America, in Nicaragua, for those of you who are familiar with the, excuse me, what's the name of the Sandinistas. Now this is an area, mountainous area in Nicaragua, that is ideal for very good coffee. We helped organize former Sandinistas into farming communities, into groups of coffee growers. Today, they are selling their coffee to some of the markets in California directly. Organize themselves into Coffee Growers Association. Now, these are just a few examples of the growing evidence of where our investments in development help communities to have direct impact on peace and security. Now, the question you should be asking, how do we unlock the potential of smallholder agriculture in the developing world so that it contributes to sustainable economic growth, global food, and nutrition security? These are programs, isolated programs, but how do we then contribute to a global landscape where this can take place? Now, over the years in my career, Abine just told you that I have a background as a biological scientist, research scientist, for some 30 years, working in various parts of the world, Asia and Africa particularly. But with my position and the work I do at IFAD, I've been able to see how firsthand how investments in rural development, trying to transform the rural space so that people take their destiny in their own hands, giving them a voice. And through that process, I have learned a few lessons. I'll share 4 of them with you. One lesson is, in development, please, one size does not fit all. A project works superbly in some part of, even within Asia or in Latin America, and you want to take it to, for example, to Pakistan. We had an example in Pakistan where we tried to introduce a program that empowered women. So they had access to financial services and had access to property. It did not go 1 inch, as we say, because it was against the culture of that community. So what did we do? We started talking to the men to show them the benefits to the family, not just to the women. And after 4 years, we started to make some success. Today we have how many associations of women's groups in this particular area? It may have worked very well in some part of the world where you work directly with the women. So there are solutions, many solutions to inequality, poverty, and hunger, but each must be tailored and targeted to a particular social context of a people. Development needs to respond to the needs of communities, and we cannot develop a solution here and transport it and expect it to work in a remote village. I mean, as a scientist, I know the excitement in making a new discovery, a new plant variety, a new idea in the social behavior of people, and so on and so forth. And immediately we want to publish it. But the question we never ask ourselves sometimes is, will it work? Have we taken into consideration the social context of the people? Because too often, what we do, we parachute consultants from X country to Y country They have brilliant ideas. They are there for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, and then they leave. But the rural people with whom we want to work know better. They know when the rain will fall. They know the weather better than we do. We should first ask and listen to them, so that whatever technology we think will work, whatever solution is tailored to the social context of the society. Another example is African agriculture is today one of the worst in terms of performance, maybe 25 to 40% of its productivity level. What is the problem? Oh, farmers don't use fertilizers. Well, yes, and they don't irrigate, and they use old varieties. So somebody says, okay, fine, we're going to work with these farmers, and we're going to give them new varieties of this crop, because this new variety can give them 4 times the yield, even under normal conditions. Fine. So, and I've seen this happen in some countries. So we subsidize new seed varieties. We give them 1 packet of fertilizer and so on and so forth. And we have a massive production. We say, agriculture, this season we had a bumper crop of maize, of corn. And then what happens? No storage facilities. Farmers cannot sell. But otherwise, at harvest, the price of maize drops, parachutes, because there's a surplus. But farmers cannot store. There are no storage facilities. There are no silos. Or even worse, the nearest market is about 5 or 10 kilometers, but there are no roads to take the produce to the market. So what is the purpose, what is the use of that technology in that context? We must, yes, development is not just something you solve by one bullet. There's no silver bullet. It involves a lot of things. Do they have infrastructure? Do they have storage facilities? Is there simple energy generating mechanism, biogas technology that can be done by any village community? So it is essential that we understand the social context within which we want to introduce a new technology. That was my first lesson. The next one is technology or advances in research and development will have the desired impact on people's lives will not have the desired impact on people's life unless the social aspect of the community are adequately addressed. Now, what do I mean? How is this different from introducing a new technology? Let me give you my experience that comes from Ethiopia. I visited about 200 kilometers south of Addis Ababa in 2013. These were 3 project sites where IFAD was supporting rural community development. In one of them, it was a creative financing institutions, rural finance. We were working with women's groups. There were a few men, but the women were in charge. They had their governance structure. They had their chairperson, their treasurer, their secretary. Well, they had grouped themselves into an association. And they worked very well. They dialogued. They had their institutional context. They had a framework. They supported other farmers through providing financial assistance for irrigation, for example. And those farmers, when they got these irrigation facilities, then put together a water users association to calibrate when to supply water to this area, when not to. It worked out perfectly. There was communication. There was recognition of the role of the women in managing the resources better. And there was a recognition that the men in the other association were needed for the irrigation system and its maintenance. It worked perfectly. Within a few years, this community was doing much better. They were making more money. They sent their children to school. And nutrition had improved. In the third project site, mostly men, when we met with them, the men all sat in front, and the women sat at the back. In the course of our conversation, there was hardly any input from the women. A simple technology which involved bagging their produce, that is tomatoes, bagging them or boxing them, had not been adopted. And just boxing their tomatoes will save the tomatoes from damage, spoilage. It had not been adopted. There was no farmers association. This leads me now to the next one. Organizational change. Building farmers' capacities through organizational change. Associations, groups, or societies or cooperatives. The people we work with must have a voice, and they must be in charge of what they do. Otherwise, whatever we introduce, they will be marginalized. Simplifying operations, teaching them how to make business plans and how to make decisions, and linking them up with markets, so that if we are trying to establish a partnership with the private sector, it must not be PPP, the 3 Ps, public-private partnerships. It has to be 4 Ps, public, private, producer partnerships. But for the producers to participate, they have to be organized in such a way that they have a voice. So we have to help them build their capacities in farming. And my final lesson, I guess I've overshot my time. My final lesson is we have to choose on whom to invest. And here, basically, is the gender dimension of investment in rural development. At IFAD, we have learned one simple lesson. In these rural communities, when you invest in a man in a rural area, you invest in an individual. When you invest in a woman, you invest in a community. And it's a community that drives the society. Because every dollar earned by women in rural populations, they invest in their children, education, school education, health, and food. And there's a compelling evidence that women's education, health, and nutritional status and decision-making power have significant impact on the health of their children. Let me quickly conclude, ladies and gentlemen. So at least we have some time for questions and answers. I'll leave you with one final thought. In many ways, I have alluded to it already. In my experience all over the world, we now live in one world, not in 2 worlds. Our world has become so small. It doesn't matter whether you're from the south or from the north or from the east or from the west. It doesn't matter whether you are rich or poor, old or young. It doesn't matter whether you are an Asian descendant or African descendant or an American or whatever it is. Our world is one world. What happens in a remote village somewhere in Timbuktu in Mali has reverberations all over the world, in Paris, in London, and New York. I gave you an example of Ebola, the migration crisis. Problems are no longer confined by geographic boundaries. In no time, they expand. Ebola knows no boundaries. Climate change knows no boundaries. And so does migration as well, or conflict for that matter. I have a strong belief in one thing, that for our world to change, it is going to be as a result of you, your generation of today. So you are the generation of today and of tomorrow. You are the future. Don't let it slip through your fingers like my generation has done. Because your children will accuse you. And I speak very boldly. I'm not ashamed of it. My generation has made a mess of the world. Please, don't make the same mistakes as we did. The future is in your hands. Thank you.